Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. The fog hung thick over Whitechapel that November morning in 1892, wrapping the narrow streets in a grey shroud that seemed to muffle even the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestone. It was the sort of morning that made respectable folk hurry past the bakers' shops and taverns with their collars turned high, avoiding eye contact with the shadowy figures that emerged from doorways like phantoms. Yet it was precisely on such a morning that Mrs. Agatha Pembroke, proprietress of Pembroke's fine bakery on Dorset Street, made a discovery that would challenge the very foundations of logic itself. I had been summoned from my breakfast by an urgent telegram from Inspector Lestrade, who had grown accustomed to seeking my friend Holmes's counsel in matters that strained the capabilities of Scotland Yard. As our hansom cab rattled through the increasingly squalid streets toward the East End, I could not help but notice Holmes's peculiar state of animation. His grey eyes darted about with that familiar intensity I'd come to associate with cases of unusual complexity, and his long fingers drummed an irregular rhythm against his knee. "Most singular, Watson," he murmured, reading Lestrade's message for the third time. "A woman found dead in a locked bakery, with no signs of violence, no obvious cause of death, and, most curious of all, surrounded by loaves of bread that appear to contain human bone fragments." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "Surely that cannot be accurate. Some mistake in the initial examination, perhaps." Holmes's thin lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile. "That is precisely what makes this case so intriguing, my dear fellow. When the impossible presents itself as fact, we must examine our assumptions about what constitutes possibility." The bakery stood at the corner of Dorset Street, a narrow building squeezed between a lodging-house and a gin palace. Even through the fog, the acrid smell of smoke and something far more unsettling reached us as we approached. A small crowd had gathered, kept at bay by two constables who looked as though they would prefer to be anywhere else in London. Lestrade met us at the door, his weathered face bearing an expression of barely controlled bewilderment. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm afraid we have something quite beyond the ordinary here. The victim is Mrs. Pembroke herself, found this morning by her assistant, Mary Clegg, when she arrived for work at 5 o'clock. The door was locked from the inside, I presume?" Holmes inquired, producing his magnifying glass and beginning his examination of the door frame before Lestrade could reply. "Indeed it was, and the windows as well, all of them. There's only one way in or out of this place, and it was sealed tight as a tomb." Lestrade paused, mopping his brow despite the morning chill. "But that's not the strangest part, I'm afraid." We followed him into the bakery proper, where the warm, yeasty scent, one might expect, was overwhelmed by something far more disturbing. Mrs. Pembroke lay beside her great wooden kneading table, her grey hair splayed across the flour-dusted floor. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully, save for the unnatural pallor of her skin and the complete absence of any rise and fall in her chest. But it was not the corpse that drew my attention, nor even the mysterious circumstances of her demise. It was the bread. Dozens of loaves lined the shelves and counters, their golden crusts gleaming in the gaslight. Yet protruding from several of them, like grotesque decorations, were unmistakable fragments of bone, yellowed, ancient-looking things that seemed to grin with malevolent purpose. "The local constable thought they might be animal bones at first," Lestrade continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But the police surgeon had a look, and he's quite certain they're human. Finger bones, he thinks, and possibly pieces of ribs." Holmes had produced his lens and was examining one of the affected loaves with the sort of intense concentration he typically reserved for the most promising clues. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The bones appear to have been kneaded directly into the dough before baking. See here, Watson. The bread has formed around them quite naturally." This was no hasty insertion after the fact. I bent to examine the evidence myself, my medical training warring with my revulsion. But Holmes, this is monstrous. What sort of person would bake human remains into bread? And why? Those, my dear Watson, are precisely the questions we must answer. Holmes straightened, his eyes now scanning the entire bakery with methodical precision. Inspector, you mentioned an assistant. Where might we find Miss Clegg? She's in the back room, still quite beside herself. Poor girl can barely speak for the shock of it all. She's worked here for 3 years, she says, and swears Mrs. Pembroke was the kindest woman in Whitechapel. Wouldn't harm a fly. Nevertheless, I should like to speak with her. But first, Holmes moved toward the great brick oven that dominated one wall of the bakery. This was lit when the body was discovered? Aye, still warm. Miss Clegg says Mrs. Pembroke often came in before dawn to start the day's baking. The bread you see there was pulled from the oven this morning, presumably by Mrs. Pembroke herself before whatever happened to her happened. Holmes crouched before the oven, peering into its sooty depths. Curious that she should have had time to complete her baking before succumbing to whatever killed her. One might expect to find her collapsed during the work, not after its completion. He straightened again, brushing ash from his hands. And you found no signs of struggle? No indication that anyone else had been present? None whatsoever. The floor shows only Mrs. Pembroke's footprints in the flour and Miss Clegg's from this morning. Everything else is exactly as one would expect to find it, save for— Lestrade gestured helplessly at the bone-studded loaves. Save for the impossible bread, Holmes finished. He moved now to examine Mrs. Pembroke's body more closely. Kneeling beside her with the same clinical detachment he brought to all his cases. No obvious wounds, no signs of poisoning about the lips or fingernails. Her clothing is undisturbed, her hair tidy. She appears to have simply stopped. As I watched my friend work, I could not shake the feeling that we were confronting something beyond the realm of ordinary crime. The locked room, the inexplicable death, the grotesque bread, each element seemed to mock the rational mind. Yet I had learned long ago never to underestimate Holmes's ability to impose order upon chaos, to find the thread of logic that connected even the most bizarre circumstances. Holmes, I ventured, might we be dealing with some form of supernatural? Watson, his voice was sharp, cutting through my speculation like a blade. You know my methods. When we have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. There is nothing supernatural about this case, merely a sequence of events we do not yet understand. He rose, dusting flour from his knees, and fixed me with that penetrating stare I knew so well. But I confess, my dear fellow, that this particular sequence promises to be among the most intriguing we have yet encountered. The fog outside seemed to press closer against the windows, as if London itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether even Sherlock Holmes could unravel a mystery that appeared to mock the very notion of rational explanation. Chapter 2. Case. Introduction. Holmes and Watson's first discussion. The journey back to Baker Street passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels upon cobblestone and the occasional sharp intake of breath from Holmes as some new aspect of the case occurred to him. I'd grown accustomed to these periods of intense mental activity, during which my friend's remarkable brain sorted and catalogued the myriad details he had observed, searching for patterns that would escape lesser minds. It was not until we had settled into our familiar chairs before the fireplace at 21B, with Mrs. Hudson's excellent tea steaming between us, that Holmes finally spoke. Watson, before we delve into the peculiarities of Mrs. Pembroke's demise, I should like to test a small theory regarding our visitor of this morning. I glanced about our sitting room, seeing no evidence of any caller. Visitor? I'm afraid I don't follow. Holmes. His grey eyes sparkled with that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction. Come now, my dear fellow. Surely you noticed the slight disarray of the Morning Post upon our return. the barely perceptible displacement of dust upon the mantelpiece, the faint aroma of lavender water that still lingers near the window. Indeed, now that he mentioned it, I could detect the subtle feminine fragrance he described. Someone was here while we were out. Mrs. Pemberton from the flat below, unless I am much mistaken. A woman of perhaps 55 years, recently widowed, who has developed what she believes to be a romantic attachment to yours truly. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture I recognized as preceding one of his more elaborate deductions. She entered using the spare key Mrs. Hudson provides for emergencies, ostensibly to water the plants, note the slight moisture still visible on the windowsill, but actually to examine our correspondence and perhaps discover some insight into my current activities. Good heavens, Holmes, how can you possibly know all that? Elementary, my dear Watson. The lavender water is Mrs. Pemberton's signature scent. I have encountered it on several occasions when she has found excuses to visit our landlady. The manner in which our post has been handled, carefully examined but hastily replaced, suggests someone seeking information while attempting to cover their tracks. As for her romantic inclinations, I observed her watching our departure from behind her curtains, and Mrs. Hudson mentioned last week that the woman had been asking rather pointed questions about my marital status. I shook my head in wonder, though after so many years of partnership, Holmes's observational powers should hardly have surprised me. But what bearing does this have on our current case? Merely a demonstration that the impossible often has remarkably mundane explanations once one applies proper analytical methods. Holmes reached for his pipe, tamping it with the sort of deliberate care that indicated he was organizing his thoughts. Now, regarding Mrs. Agatha Pembroke and her most unusual bakery. He drew several puffs of smoke, staring into the fire as if the dancing flames might reveal the secrets we sought. What struck you most forcibly about the crime scene, Watson? I considered the question carefully. Well, the locked room aspect is certainly puzzling, but I confess the bread containing human bones was what most disturbed me. The implications are quite horrifying. Indeed they are, but let us examine the logical inconsistencies before we allow our emotions to cloud our judgment. Holmes leaned forward, his voice taking on the crisp, analytical tone I knew well. Consider the sequence of events as presented to us. Mrs. Pembroke arrives before dawn, lights her oven, prepares her dough, incorporating human bone fragments in the process, bakes her bread, removes it from the oven, and then dies of unknown causes, all while sealed alone in her shop. When you put it that way, it does seem rather improbable. Improbable, Watson, is a considerable understatement. It is patently absurd. Holmes rose and began pacing before the fireplace, his pipe trailing smoke like a locomotive. What sort of baker, even one with the most macabre inclinations, would deliberately contaminate her wares with human remains? The very act would render the bread unsaleable, destroying her livelihood. Perhaps she was mad, driven to some sort of ghoulish compulsion? Ah, but there we encounter another inconsistency. According to Miss Clegg, Mrs. R. Pembroke was known throughout Whitechapel as a woman of uncommon kindness and sound mind. Madness of the sort you describe rarely develops overnight, and would surely have manifested itself in other ways before reaching such an extreme. I set down my teacup, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. Then what are you suggesting, Holmes? That someone else was responsible? I am suggesting, my dear fellow, that we are dealing with a carefully constructed deception, designed to present us with an impossible scenario. Holmes paused in his pacing, turning to face me with an expression of grim satisfaction. Someone wishes us to believe that Agatha Pembroke baked human bones into bread, and then died mysteriously in a locked room. The question we must ask ourselves is, who benefits from such a grotesque charade? And why? Before I could respond, we were interrupted by a sharp rap at our door. Mrs. Hudson's voice called from below, announcing a visitor. Moments later, a young woman of perhaps 25 ascended to our sitting room, her face pale with exhaustion and her hands trembling despite her obvious efforts at composure. "Mr. Holmes, I'm Mary Clegg, Mrs. Pembroke's assistant. Inspector Lestrade said you might be willing to help find whoever did this terrible thing to her." Holmes was on his feet immediately, offering her a chair near the fire. "Please, Miss Clegg, make yourself comfortable. Dr. Watson, perhaps you would be so kind as to ask Mrs. Hudson for some brandy. Miss Clegg appears to have had quite an ordeal." As I departed on this errand, I heard Holmes's voice, gentler than usual, encouraging the young woman to take her time and tell us everything she could remember about her employer and the events of that morning. When I returned with the brandy, Miss Clegg had regained some color in her cheeks and was speaking in a steady, if subdued voice. "Mrs. Pembroke was like a mother to me, Mr. Holmes. When I lost my position at the textile mill, she took me in without a moment's hesitation. Said she needed help with the early morning baking, but I know she created the position out of kindness." Tears welled in her eyes, but she continued bravely. "She was no more capable of the horrible things they're saying than I am of flying to the moon." "What sorts of things are they saying, Miss Clegg?" Holmes inquired, settling back into his chair. "That she was a witch, sir. That she practiced dark arts and made unholy bargains. There's talk in the streets that she got those bones from the graveyard, that she was trying to raise the dead or some such nonsense." Her voice grew stronger as indignation overcame grief. "It's wicked lies, every word of it. Mrs. Pembroke was a God-fearing woman who never missed Sunday service." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "These rumors began this morning after the discovery." "Oh no, sir. They've been whispered about for weeks now. Ever since." She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Please, Miss Clegg, no detail is too small or seemingly insignificant." "Well, sir, it started about a month ago when old Tom Wessex claimed he saw lights moving about in the bakery at all hours of the night. Said he heard chanting and smelled sulfur. Most folks dismissed him as drunk. Tom does like his gin. But then others began to report strange happenings." Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. "What sort of strange happenings?" "Customers complained that their bread had an odd taste, sir. Nothing specific, mind you, just different. And there were reports of people falling ill after eating Mrs. Pembroke's baking, though she always used the finest ingredients." Miss Clegg twisted her handkerchief in her hands. "Mrs. Pembroke was terribly upset by it all. She couldn't understand what was happening to her reputation." "Did she change anything about her routine or her recipes during this period?" "That's just it, Mr. Holmes. She didn't change anything at all. Used the same suppliers she'd used for years, the same methods her mother taught her. She was convinced someone was deliberately trying to ruin her business, but she couldn't prove it." As Miss Clegg spoke, I observed Holmes's expression grow increasingly thoughtful. Here, at last, were the beginnings of a pattern, the suggestion of human agency behind what had initially appeared to be an impossible crime. "One final question, Miss Clegg," Holmes said gently. "This morning, when you discovered Mrs. Pembroke, did you notice anything unusual about the bread itself beyond the obvious?" She shuddered slightly. "Only that it looked so perfectly normal, sir. Golden and beautiful, just as always. If not for those horrible things sticking out of it, you'd never know anything was wrong." She paused, then added quietly, "That's what makes it so frightening, isn't it? Evil disguised as something wholesome." After Miss Clegg departed, Holmes and I sat in contemplative silence. The fog had begun to lift outside our windows, but the mystery before us seemed only to deepen with each new revelation. Chapter 3. The First Clues. A Scene of Deception. The following morning brought crisp November sunshine that seemed to mock the darkness of our investigation. Holmes had risen before dawn, a habit that invariably signaled his complete absorption in a case, and I found him at breakfast, fully dressed and studying a collection of notes he had made during the night. "Ah, Watson, I trust you slept better than I did. The Pembroke case has been rattling about in my mind like a caged animal." He gestured to a chair across from him. "I've been considering Miss Clegg's account, and I believe we must return to Dorset Street for a more thorough examination of the scene. Surely Lestrade and his men have completed their investigation by now." Holmes's thin smile held no warmth. "My dear fellow, you give the good inspector far too much credit. Scotland Yard sees what they expect to see: a locked room, a dead woman, and inexplicable bread. They will file their report, declare the case unsolvable, and move on to matters more suited to their limited capabilities." Within the hour, we were once again rattling through the narrow streets of Whitechapel. The baker's shop stood empty now, sealed with official police tape, but Holmes had anticipated this obstacle and produced a key from his waistcoat pocket. "Holmes, where on earth did you acquire that?" "From Miss Clegg, of course. I took the liberty of borrowing it during her visit yesterday, knowing we would need unfettered access to the scene." He unlocked the door with practiced efficiency. "Sometimes, Watson, the unofficial investigation proves far more illuminating than the official one." The bakery appeared much as we had left it, though the absence of Lestrade's bustling constables lent the place an almost sepulchral atmosphere. The bone-studded loaves remained on their shelves, now covered with cloth as if someone had attempted to hide their grotesque nature from prying eyes. Holmes immediately set about his work with the methodical precision I had observed countless times before. He began at the entrance, examining every inch of the door frame with his magnifying glass, then progressed systematically through the shop, pausing to investigate details that would have escaped any ordinary observer. "Most interesting," he murmured. Crouching beside the great kneading table where Mrs. Pembroke's body had been found. "Watson, observe the flower patterns on this surface." I joined him, though I confess I could see nothing remarkable about the white dust that coated the wooden table. "What am I looking for, Holmes?" "Note the distribution, my dear fellow. Here, where one would expect to find the heaviest concentration from actual kneading work, the flour is relatively sparse. Yet along the edges, particularly near the far side, we find a much thicker accumulation." He traced patterns in the flour with his finger. This suggests that someone deliberately scattered flour across the surface to obscure something, perhaps fingerprints or evidence of how the table was actually used. Moving to examine the bone-containing loaves more closely, Holmes produced a small knife from his pocket and carefully extracted one of the protruding fragments. "Remarkable preservation for human remains," he observed, holding the yellowed bone up to the light. "Far too old to be recent, yet not ancient enough to have come from some archaeological excavation." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting, Watson, that these bones have been stored somewhere for a considerable period, perhaps a year or more, before being incorporated into yesterday's baking." He wrapped the fragment in his handkerchief. "We shall need to have this examined by an expert, but I suspect we will find it has been treated with some preservative substance." Holmes next turned his attention to the great brick oven, crawling partially inside to examine its depths with his lens. When he emerged, his face was smudged with soot, but his expression held the satisfaction of discovery. Most illuminating indeed. "Watson, what would you expect to find in an oven that had been used for regular bread baking?" "Well, the usual debris, I suppose. Flour, perhaps some burnt crusts." "Precisely. Yet what I find here is far more intriguing." He held up a small, twisted piece of metal. "This appears to be a fragment of wire, the sort used in electrical applications. And here," he produced another small object, this one wrapped in ash. "A piece of clockwork mechanism, badly damaged by heat." I stared at these peculiar artifacts, struggling to comprehend their significance. What possible connection could these have to bread baking? None whatsoever, which is precisely what makes them so significant. Holmes pocketed both items carefully. Someone has been using this oven for purposes quite unrelated to Mrs. Pembroke's legitimate business. As we continued our examination, Holmes's attention was drawn to a section of the brick wall behind the ovens. He spent several minutes running his hands along the mortar joints, occasionally tapping with his knuckles. "Curious," he muttered. "Watson, listen carefully." He rapped sharply against one particular brick. The sound was distinctly hollow, different from the solid thuds produced by its neighbors. "A hidden cavity?" "So it would appear." Holmes examined the brick more closely, then began working at the mortar with his knife. After several minutes of careful chipping, the brick shifted slightly. I believe we have found something of considerable interest." With a final effort, the brick came free, revealing a small space behind. Holmes reached inside and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its cover stained and worn. "Mrs. Pembroke's private thoughts, perhaps," I suggested. Holmes opened the journal carefully, scanning the first few pages. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read. "Not Mrs. Pembroke's, I'm afraid. The handwriting belongs to someone else entirely, someone with a very different agenda." He read aloud from one of the entries. "Day 12 of the treatment. The old woman suspects nothing. The new mixture is proving most effective. Customers report the desired symptoms within hours of consumption. Soon she will be so discredited that the acquisition can proceed as planned." Good God, Holmes. Someone was deliberately poisoning Mrs. Pembroke's customers. It would appear so. And note this entry from last week. The bone fragments are prepared and ready for implementation. The final phase will require careful timing. The discovery must appear natural, yet so shocking that no further investigation will be undertaken. Holmes continued reading, his face growing darker with each page. "This is not the work of some deranged individual, Watson. This is a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy Mrs. Pembroke's reputation and drive her from business, or worse. But who would go to such elaborate lengths, and why?" Before Holmes could answer, we heard footsteps approaching the shop. Quickly, he returned the journal to its hiding place and replaced the brick, working with practiced speed to conceal any evidence of our discovery. "Someone comes," he whispered. "We must not be found here with our newfound knowledge. Whoever orchestrated this affair may still be watching." We moved swiftly toward the rear of the bakery, where Holmes had earlier noted a small door leading to the alley behind. As we slipped out into the narrow passage, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure in a dark coat entering the front of the shop. "Did you see who that was?" I asked in a low voice. Holmes's expression was grim. "I saw enough, Watson, and I suspect our mysterious visitor is about to discover that their carefully concealed journal has been disturbed." As we made our way through the winding alleys back toward the main thoroughfare, Holmes was unusually silent. I could see his mind working furiously, processing the implications of what we had discovered. "Holmes," I ventured, "that journal suggests Mrs. Pembroke was the victim of a deliberate conspiracy. But how does that explain her death? And the locked room?" He paused at the mouth of the alley, glancing back toward the bakery with eyes that held both determination and concern. "Those, my dear Watson, are the questions that will lead us to our culprit. But I fear we are dealing with someone far more dangerous than a common criminal. Someone who has planned this affair with meticulous care and will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their scheme." The morning sun had climbed higher, but somehow the streets of Whitechapel seemed darker than before. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Our return to Baker Street was interrupted by an unexpected encounter at the corner of Commercial Street. Inspector Lestrade emerged from a hansom cab, his face bearing the harried expression of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his comprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, most fortuitous that I should find you here." He approached with evident relief. "I'm afraid the Pembroke case has taken several disturbing turns since yesterday." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed. What developments have occurred? 3 more deaths, sir, all connected to that cursed bakery. Dr. Hartwell from Whitechapel Road was found dead in his surgery this morning, apparently from the same mysterious cause that took Mrs. Pembroke. No signs of violence, no obvious explanation. Lestrade mopped his brow with a stained handkerchief. And that's not the worst of it. Pray continue, Inspector. Thomas Wickham, who owns the property where the bakery stands, was discovered collapsed in his office last evening. His clerk found him slumped over his desk, stone dead. And old Samuel Crenshaw, who supplied Mrs. Pembroke with flour for nigh on 20 years, they pulled him from the Thames early this morning. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Good heavens, 3 more deaths in as many days? 4, if you count Mrs. Pembroke, Lestrade corrected grimly. The local population is in a state of near panic. There's talk of curses and supernatural vengeance. Some fool has been spreading stories about Mrs. Pembroke's ghost seeking revenge on those who wronged her. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. Most interesting. Tell me, Inspector, what was Dr. Hartwell's connection to Mrs. Pembroke beyond the obvious geographical proximity? He'd been treating several of her customers recently. People who claimed to have fallen ill after eating bread from her shop. Been quite vocal about it too, suggesting there might be something unwholesome about her baking practices. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Between you and me, Mr. Holmes, his accusations were contributing to the rumors about her involvement in dark practices. And, Mr. Wickham, was he merely Mrs. Pembroke's landlord, or did their relationship extend beyond commercial concerns? That's where things become peculiar, sir. According to his clerk, Wickham had been pressuring Mrs. Pembroke to vacate the premises for months. Claimed he had a buyer willing to pay triple the current rent, but she refused to leave. There were several heated exchanges, witnesses say. Holmes began walking slowly along the street, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner that indicated deep thought. And Mr. Crenshaw, the flour supplier? Ah, now there's a strange tale indeed. Lestrade fell into step beside us. Seems Crenshaw had recently informed Mrs. Pembroke that he could no longer provide her with flour. Claimed his regular mills were having quality problems, but his other customers received no such notice. She was quite distressed about it, according to Miss Clegg. A most illuminating pattern emerges, Holmes murmured. 4 individuals, all recently deceased, all having had some form of conflict or professional disagreement with Mrs. Pembroke in the weeks preceding her death. You think there's a connection beyond the supernatural nonsense the locals are spouting? Inspector, I'm certain of it. However, I suspect the true nature of that connection is quite different from what either the local population or Scotland Yard might suppose. We had reached Baker Street, and Holmes paused before our door. I wonder, Lestrade, if you might arrange for us to examine the premises where these other deaths occurred, and perhaps interview any witnesses who might have observed the deceased in their final days? Certainly, Mr. Holmes. Though I warn you, the locals are becoming increasingly agitated. There's been talk of burning down the bakery, and several families have already fled the area. After Lestrade departed to make the necessary arrangements, Holmes and I retired to our sitting room. He immediately began pacing before the fireplace, his pipe sending wreaths of smoke toward the ceiling. Watson, we are dealing with something far more sophisticated than a simple revenge plot. The death of Mrs. Pembroke was merely the beginning. A carefully orchestrated campaign designed to eliminate everyone who might expose the true nature of what was happening at that bakery. But Holmes, if someone was deliberately poisoning Mrs. Pembroke's customers, why kill the doctor who was treating them? Surely Dr. Hartwell's involvement would only lend credence to the poisoning theory. An excellent question, my dear fellow, and one that suggests Dr. Hartwell had discovered something beyond mere poisoning, something that threatened to expose the entire conspiracy. Holmes paused in his pacing, staring into the fire. Consider the evidence we found this morning. The mechanical fragments in the oven, the preserved bones, the journal documenting a systematic campaign of sabotage. This was not the work of a lone malcontent. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced another visitor. To our surprise, it was Miss Clegg, but she was not alone. A stout, well-dressed gentleman accompanied her, his ruddy face bearing an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion," Miss Clegg began, "but Mr. Pemberton insisted on meeting with you immediately. He has information about Mrs. Pembroke that he says might be important." The gentleman stepped forward, removing his hat nervously. "Jeremiah Pemberton, sir, of Pemberton and Associates. Solicitors, I handled certain legal matters for Mrs. Pembroke, and in light of recent events—" He paused, glancing around our sitting room as if expecting hidden listeners. "Perhaps we might speak privately." Holmes gestured to chairs near the fire. "Please, both of you, make yourselves comfortable. Dr. Watson is my trusted partner in all matters, and Miss Clegg has already proven herself invaluable to our investigation." Pemberton settled heavily into his chair, mopping his brow despite the cool weather. "Mr. Holmes, I fear I may have contributed to Mrs. Pembroke's death through my professional negligence. 3 weeks ago, she came to me in great distress, claiming that someone was deliberately sabotaging her business. What evidence did she present to support this claim? She brought samples of flour that she insisted had been tampered with, said it had an unusual odor and texture that wasn't present when she purchased it from Crenshaw. She also had testimonials from several customers who claimed to have been made ill by her bread, though they had eaten from the same batches without experiencing any problems herself." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "Did you take any action on her behalf?" "I'm ashamed to say I did not, sir. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and I feared she might be suffering from the strain of recent business pressures. I advised her to perhaps consider retirement, or at least a brief respite from her work." Pemberton's voice grew heavy with regret. "If I had taken her concerns more seriously—" "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes interrupted gently, "you could not have prevented what occurred. The forces arrayed against Mrs. Pembroke were far more sophisticated than anyone could have anticipated from her initial complaints." Miss Clegg had been listening intently and now spoke up with obvious distress. "Mr. Holmes, there's something else you should know. This morning, before coming here, I went to the bakery to collect some of Mrs. Pembroke's personal belongings. The place had been ransacked." "Ransacked?" Holmes's attention was immediately focused. "In what manner?" "Everything had been searched through. Drawers emptied, papers scattered, even the floorboards pried up in some places. But here's the strange part. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Her jewelry box was untouched, and there was still money in the till from the day before yesterday." Holmes rose and began pacing again, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Someone was searching for something specific, possibly the same journal we discovered, or other evidence of the conspiracy against her." Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There's one more thing, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Pembroke mentioned that she had been approached several times in recent months by a gentleman claiming to represent a development company. He offered to purchase her lease at a substantial profit, but she refused. She said there was something unsettling about the man, claimed he knew far too much about her personal circumstances for a legitimate business representative." "Did she provide any description of this individual?" "Only that he was tall, well-dressed, and spoke with what she described as an educated accent. He carried himself like a gentleman, but she said his eyes were cold, like looking into a winter pond," were her exact words. As our visitors prepared to depart, Holmes drew Miss Clegg aside. "I must ask you to exercise extreme caution in the coming days. If our suspicions are correct, you may be in considerable danger simply by virtue of your association with Mrs. Pembroke." "What should I do, Mr. Holmes?" "Stay away from the bakery. Avoid discussing the case with anyone beyond Dr. Watson and myself. And if you notice anyone following you or asking unusual questions, contact us immediately." After they had gone, Holmes stood at the window, staring down at the street below with an expression of deep concern. "Watson, we are confronting something far more dangerous than a simple murder case. This appears to be a carefully coordinated effort involving multiple individuals, significant resources, and a willingness to eliminate anyone who threatens their objectives. But what could possibly be worth such elaborate measures? A bakery in Whitechapel hardly seems like a prize worth killing for." Holmes turned from the window, his grey eyes holding a cold gleam that I had learned to associate with his most perilous cases. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must discover before the body count rises any higher." Chapter 5. First Suspects, the Red Herring. The next morning brought news that would have delighted Scotland Yard had they possessed the wit to recognize its dangerous implications. Inspector Lestrade arrived at our door before we had finished breakfast, his face flushed with the excitement of apparent success. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, we've had a breakthrough in the Pembroke case. Arrested a suspect not 2 hours past." Holmes set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his expression betraying none of the interest I knew he must feel. "Indeed. And what evidence led to this fortuitous apprehension?" "The fellow practically confessed, sir. Name of Edgar Blackwood, a strange, reclusive sort who's been living in a boarding house not 3 streets from the bakery. The landlady came forward after hearing about the deaths, said he'd been acting peculiar for weeks, muttering about revenge and justice." "Muttering, you say? How remarkably convenient." Lestrade either missed or chose to ignore the sardonic note in Holmes's voice. "But that's not the half of it, Mr. Holmes. When we searched his room, we found a collection of bones. Human bones, by the look of them, wrapped in old newspapers. And books, sir, dozens of books about poisons, ancient rituals, and what the constables are calling dark magic." I confess that even I felt a momentary surge of relief at this news. After the bewildering complexity of our investigation thus far, the prospect of a simple, if disturbed, culprit held considerable appeal. Holmes, however, was regarding Lestrade with the expression he typically reserved for particularly obtuse witnesses. "Tell me, Inspector, did Mr. Blackwood offer any explanation for his supposed crimes?" "Claims he doesn't remember anything about them, sir. Says he's been having terrible nightmares and periods where he can't account for his time. The local doctor thinks he might be suffering from some form of mental affliction." Lestrade puffed out his chest proudly. "Of course, that won't save him from the gallows." "And his motive for targeting Mrs. Pembroke specifically?" "Ah, well, that's where it gets interesting. Turns out Blackwood was briefly employed at the bakery some 2 years ago. Mrs. Pembroke dismissed him after catching him stealing from the till. The landlady says he's nursed a grudge ever since, claiming she ruined his reputation in the neighborhood." Holmes rose from his chair and began his familiar pacing routine. "Most illuminating, Inspector. I don't suppose Mr. Blackwood has offered any explanation for how he managed to commit these crimes from within a locked room?" "Well, no, sir. But we figure he must have had some way of getting in and out without being detected. Perhaps a hidden passage, or maybe he had a duplicate key." "And the other deaths? Dr. Hartwell, Mr. Wickham, Mr. Crenshaw?" Lestrade's confidence wavered slightly. "We're still investigating those connections, but it stands to reason that if Blackwood was willing to kill Mrs. Pembroke, he might have targeted anyone who could expose his methods." "I see. And where is Mr. Blackwood now?" "In a cell at Scotland Yard, sir. Refuses to speak to anyone except to repeat that he can't remember anything. The magistrate will likely order a competency hearing." After Lestrade departed, clearly expecting congratulations that were not forthcoming, Holmes turned to me with an expression of profound skepticism. "Watson, what is your assessment of Inspector Lestrade's miraculous breakthrough?" I considered the matter carefully. "Well, Holmes, it does seem rather convenient that all the evidence should point so clearly to one individual, and his convenient loss of memory strikes me as suspiciously theatrical." "Precisely my thoughts, my dear fellow. The whole affair has been arranged with theatrical precision." A disturbed individual with a plausible motive, damning physical evidence conveniently discovered, and a mental condition that prevents him from offering a coherent defense. You believe Mr. Blackwood is innocent? I believe Mr. Blackwood is a pawn in a much larger game. Someone has taken considerable trouble to ensure that he would be discovered with precisely the evidence needed to satisfy Scotland Yard's limited imagination. Holmes moved to his desk and began sorting through the notes he had compiled during our investigation. Consider the timeline, Watson. Mrs. Pembroke dies under impossible circumstances on Monday. By Wednesday, 3 more individuals connected to the case are dead. And by Friday, Scotland Yard has their suspect, complete with confessions and physical evidence. Does this strike you as the work of a mentally disturbed individual acting on ancient grudges? When you put it that way, it does seem rather orchestrated. Indeed it does. Someone has been watching our investigation closely, Watson, and has decided that the time has come to provide the authorities with a convenient scapegoat. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by a commotion in the street below. Looking out the window, I observed a small crowd gathering around a hansom cab that had pulled up before our door. A woman was emerging from the vehicle, her movements hurried and agitated. Holmes, we have another visitor. The woman who ascended to our sitting room was perhaps 40 years of age, well-dressed but clearly in a state of considerable distress. Her dark hair was disheveled, and her hands trembled as she clutched a small leather satchel. Mr. Holmes, I am Mrs. Catherine Blackwood, Edgar's sister. I must speak with you about this terrible mistake. Holmes gestured to a chair near the fire. Please, Mrs. Blackwood, compose yourself. Dr. Watson, perhaps some brandy. Thank you, sir, but I haven't time for pleasantries. They've arrested my brother for those horrible murders. But I know he couldn't have done such things. Edgar is gentle as a lamb. Wouldn't harm a soul. Tell us about your brother's recent behavior, Mrs. Blackwood. Inspector Lestrade mentioned that he had been acting strangely. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Edgar has always been different, Mr. Holmes. Since our parents died, he's lived quietly, keeping to himself, reading his books, but these past few weeks, he's been like a man possessed. In what way? He would disappear for hours at a time, returning home with no memory of where he'd been. His clothing would be dirty, sometimes torn, and he would smell of strange chemicals. When I asked him about it, he would become agitated, claiming that someone was controlling his actions. Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. Controlling his actions? Did he elaborate on this claim? He said he would wake up in unfamiliar places, sometimes holding objects he didn't remember acquiring. Books, bottles of strange substances, even. She shuddered. Even those horrible bone fragments the police found in his room. Did your brother ever mention receiving visits from strangers, or being approached by anyone offering work or assistance? Mrs. Blackwood's eyes widened. Why, yes. About a month ago, a gentleman came to see Edgar at his lodgings. Edgar was quite excited about it, said the man was interested in his knowledge of historical research and might have employment for him. Can you describe this gentleman? Edgar said he was tall and distinguished, with an educated manner of speaking. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself like a person of quality. Edgar was quite flattered by the attention. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. The description matched perfectly with Mr. Pemberton's account of the mysterious gentleman who had approached Mrs. Pembroke about purchasing her lease. Mrs. Blackwood, has your brother ever shown any interest in chemistry or pharmacology? Good heavens, no. Edgar's interests run to medieval history and folklore. He couldn't distinguish arsenic from aspirin if his life depended on it. Yet the police found books on poisons and ancient rituals in his possession. Books that appeared in his room without explanation, Mr. Holmes. Edgar was as surprised by them as anyone. He claimed someone must have placed them there while he was away. After Mrs. Blackwood departed, promising to keep us informed of any developments in her brother's case, Holmes sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. Watson, We are dealing with someone of considerable sophistication and resources. They have successfully manipulated a vulnerable individual into becoming their unwitting accomplice, then arranged for his discovery at precisely the moment when Scotland Yard needed a convenient solution. But what purpose does framing Mr. Blackwood serve? Surely the real criminals would prefer to remain undetected. On the contrary, my dear fellow, by providing the authorities with a satisfying explanation for these crimes, they effectively end any serious investigation into the true nature of what was occurring at Mrs. Pembroke's bakery. Holmes rose and moved to the window, staring down at the street with an expression of grim determination. While Scotland Yard congratulates itself on solving an impossible case, the real perpetrators are free to complete whatever scheme required Mrs. Pembroke's death in the first place. Then we must expose Mr. Blackwood's innocence. Indeed we must, Watson, but we must do so carefully. If our adversaries are willing to orchestrate 4 murders and frame an innocent man, they will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose their deception. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across our sitting room. Somewhere in London, Edgar Blackwood sat in a jail cell, awaiting trial for crimes he could not remember committing. And somewhere else, the true architects of this elaborate conspiracy were undoubtedly congratulating themselves on their success. But they had not reckoned with Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 6. The secret clue, a hidden inconsistency. The following evening found Holmes in one of his most contemplative moods, seated before the fire with his pipe wreathed in contemplative smoke. He had spent the better part of the day examining the bone fragment we had recovered from the bakery, subjecting it to various chemical tests in his makeshift laboratory. The results, it seemed, had provided him with information of considerable significance. "Watson," he said at length, breaking the silence that had settled over our sitting room, "I've made a discovery that fundamentally alters our understanding of this case." I set aside the medical journal I had been reading, accustomed to these moments when Holmes's investigations took unexpected turns. "What have you found?" He held up the yellowed bone fragment, now stained with various chemical reagents. "This bone, which formed such a crucial part of the evidence against Mrs. Pembroke, tells a story quite different from what Scotland Yard believes." "In what way?" "The chemical analysis reveals traces of formaldehyde and other preservative compounds, confirming my earlier suspicion that these remains had been stored for an extended period. But more significantly, I've detected the presence of a particular mineral compound, calcium phosphate treated with ferric oxide, that is used exclusively in museum preservation techniques." I leaned forward with interest. "You're suggesting these bones came from a museum collection?" "I'm stating it as fact, my dear fellow. Furthermore, the specific combination of preservatives indicates a process developed within the last decade by the Natural History Museum for their osteological specimens. These are not the remains of some unfortunate victim of Edgar Blackwood's supposed madness. They are legitimate scientific specimens, stolen for the express purpose of creating this grotesque deception." Holmes rose and moved to his desk, withdrawing a telegram from among his papers. "I took the liberty of making enquiries at the museum this afternoon. Dr. Pemberton Fairfax, the curator of osteological specimens, confirmed that several bone fragments went missing from their collection approximately 6 weeks ago." "Missing? Was theft suspected?" "Curiously, no. Dr. Fairfax initially assumed they had been mislaid during a recent reorganization of the collection. The missing pieces were relatively minor specimens, finger bones, rib fragments, precisely the sort of thing that would escape immediate notice." Holmes's expression grew increasingly grave. "However, when I described the circumstances of their discovery, Dr. Fairfax became most agitated. It seems he had received a visit from a gentleman claiming to represent a private collector, someone who expressed particular interest in acquiring similar specimens for educational purposes. The same mysterious gentleman who approached Mrs. Pembroke and Edgar Blackwood. The description matches perfectly. Tall, distinguished, well-educated, with what Dr. Fairfax described as penetrating cold eyes. The man presented impressive credentials and offered substantial payment for legitimate specimens, but Dr. Fairfax declined, as museum policy prohibits such transactions. Holmes began pacing before the fireplace, his movements betraying an inner tension I had learned to recognize as the precursor to his most brilliant deductions. Watson, consider the implications of this discovery. Someone with considerable resources and planning went to extraordinary lengths to acquire museum-quality bone specimens, preserve them for weeks, and then incorporate them into Mrs. Pembroke's bread in such a manner as to suggest supernatural or pathological behavior. But why go to such elaborate measures? Surely there are simpler ways to discredit a baker. You believe someone wanted to ensure that the bakery would be abandoned. I believe someone needed to ensure that the bakery and its environs would be thoroughly evacuated, and that no curious investigators would probe too deeply into the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Pembroke's death. Before I could respond to this startling theory, we were interrupted by an urgent knocking at our door. Mrs. Hudson's voice called from below, announcing Inspector Lestrade. When the inspector appeared in our sitting room moments later, his face bore an expression of profound confusion. Lestrade consulted his notebook nervously. He claims to remember standing in Mrs. Pembroke's bakery in the dead of night, mixing some sort of powder into her flour supplies. Says he was wearing gloves and carrying a small lantern, and that someone was giving him instructions from the shadows. Holmes's attention was immediately focused. Instructions? He claims someone else was present. That's what he says, sir. Describes a tall gentleman in a dark coat who directed his actions, but whose face he never clearly saw. Claims this man provided him with keys to the bakery and told him exactly what to do. And you believe this to be another manifestation of his mental illness? Well, sir, that was my initial assumption. But then Blackwood began describing other incidents. Visits to Dr. Hartwell's surgery, to Mr. Wickham's office, even to the riverside where Mr. Crenshaw was found. In each case, he claims to have been acting under the direction of this mysterious figure. Holmes leaned forward intently. Inspector, has anyone examined Mr. Blackwood for signs of drug administration? Drug administration? Whatever do you mean? There are certain pharmaceutical compounds, derivatives of scopolamine, for instance, that can render an individual highly susceptible to suggestion while leaving them with fragmented memories of their actions. Such substances have been used by unscrupulous practitioners to create unwitting accomplices. Lestrade's expression grew alarmed. Are you suggesting that Blackwood was drugged, that someone was controlling his actions chemically? I'm suggesting it as a distinct possibility. Have the police surgeon examine Mr. Blackwood's blood and hair for traces of unusual compounds. I suspect you will find evidence that supports his claims of involuntary action. After Lestrade departed, promising to arrange for the suggested medical examination, Holmes returned to his contemplation of the fire. The revelation about the museum bones, combined with Edgar Blackwood's emerging memories, had clearly provided him with crucial insights into the true nature of our adversary. Watson, we are dealing with someone of remarkable sophistication, a person with access to specialized knowledge, considerable financial resources, and a complete absence of moral scruples. But what could possibly justify such elaborate measures? What is so valuable about Mrs. Pembroke's bakery that someone would orchestrate multiple murders to obtain it? Holmes turned from the fire, his grey eyes holding a cold gleam that I had learned to associate with his most dangerous cases. That, my dear fellow, is the question that will lead us to our culprit. But I suspect the answer lies not in what the bakery contains, but in what lies beneath it. Beneath it. Consider the location, Watson. Dorset Street in Whitechapel, one of the most notorious areas of London, yet also one of the most strategically positioned. The underground railway system is expanding rapidly through this district, and there are rumors of significant commercial development planned for the area. Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a map of London, spreading it before us. Now observe the precise location of Mrs. Pembroke's bakery in relation to the proposed railway extensions and the new commercial districts being developed by various investment syndicates. As I studied the map, the implications of Holmes's theory began to emerge with startling clarity. The bakery occupied a corner position that would be crucial to any major development of the area, a small property that could potentially block or enable massive construction projects worth thousands of pounds. Good heavens, Holmes, you believe Mrs. Pembroke was murdered for her property? I believe Mrs. Pembroke was murdered because she refused to abandon property that someone else desperately needed to acquire. And I suspect that before this case is concluded, we will discover that the true motives behind these crimes involve sums of money that would make murder seem a trivial consideration to those involved. The evening had grown late, and the fog was beginning to gather outside our windows. Somewhere in London, Edgar Blackwood sat in his cell, struggling to separate genuine memories from chemically induced actions. And somewhere else, the architects of this elaborate conspiracy undoubtedly believed they had successfully eliminated every obstacle to their plans. They were about to discover how gravely they had underestimated the persistence of Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The morning brought news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our investigation. I awoke to find Holmes already dressed and examining a telegram that had arrived during the night, his face bearing an expression of mingled surprise and grim satisfaction. "Watson, we have encountered a development that our adversaries most certainly did not anticipate." I joined him at the breakfast table, noting the unusual tension in his manner. "What has occurred?" "Edgar Blackwood has escaped from Scotland Yard's custody." "Escaped? Good heavens! How is that possible?" Holmes handed me the telegram, which bore the urgent seal of Inspector Lestrade. According to this message, Blackwood vanished from his cell sometime during the night, despite being under constant guard. The constable on duty claims he checked the cell at midnight and found it secure. But when the morning shift arrived, they discovered only an empty room and a window that had been forced from the inside. I studied the telegram with growing bewilderment. But surely the building was watched. There must be some explanation for how he managed to escape undetected. Indeed there must, my dear fellow. But I suspect the explanation will prove to be far different from what Scotland Yard imagines. Holmes rose and moved to the window, staring down at the street with the intense concentration that signaled his mind working at its highest capacity. "Consider the timing, Watson. Yesterday, we discovered evidence that contradicts the official theory of Blackwood's guilt. Last night, Blackwood begins recovering memories that implicate unknown accomplices. And this morning, he conveniently disappears before he can provide testimony that might expose the true perpetrators. The implications struck me with sudden clarity. You believe his escape was arranged by the same people who orchestrated his initial framing? I'm certain of it. Blackwood was useful as a scapegoat while he remained confused and defenseless. But the moment he began to recover his faculties and remember details that could expose the conspiracy, he became a liability that needed to be eliminated. Before I could respond, we heard rapid footsteps on the stairs. Inspector Lestrade burst into our sitting room without ceremony, his face flushed with exertion and barely controlled panic. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you're here. We have a crisis of unprecedented proportions." Holmes gestured calmly to a chair. "Please, Inspector, compose yourself and tell us exactly what has transpired." "It's not just Blackwood's escape, sir, though that's problematic enough. We've discovered something far more disturbing." Lestrade mopped his brow with a trembling hand. "When we searched his cell this morning, we found a message carved into the wall, apparently done with a piece of broken stone from the window frame." "What did this message say?" "The truth lies beneath the bread. That's all, sir, but it's written in what appears to be blood. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. Blood? Has it been analyzed? The police surgeon had a preliminary look. Says it's definitely human, but not fresh. Perhaps several hours old. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There's more, Mr. Holmes. We found Edgar Blackwood. A chill ran down my spine at the inspector's tone. Found him? Where? Floating in the Thames, sir. Body washed up near London Bridge about an hour after we discovered his empty cell. The preliminary examination suggests he'd been dead for several hours before his escape was discovered. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he processed this startling information. Inspector, you're telling us that Edgar Blackwood was murdered in his cell and his death was then disguised as an escape. That appears to be the case, sir. The constable on duty swears the cell was occupied at midnight, but the medical evidence suggests Blackwood died sometime before 11 o'clock. And what was the constable doing during those crucial hours? Lestrade's discomfort became more pronounced. That's where the story becomes even stranger, Mr. Holmes. Constable Williams claims he remembers checking the cell multiple times throughout the night, but when pressed for details, he admits his memories are unusually vague. Says he felt drowsy and disoriented, almost as if he'd been drinking, though he swears he touched no alcohol. Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing, his mind clearly racing through the implications of these revelations. The same methods used to control Edgar Blackwood have now been employed against Scotland Yard itself. Someone with access to the building, knowledge of police procedures, and sophisticated chemical compounds has eliminated their unwitting accomplice while making it appear that he escaped. But why go to such elaborate measures? I asked. Surely a simple death in custody could have been explained as suicide. Because, Watson, our adversaries needed Blackwood to disappear completely. A suicide would have prompted questions, an investigation, possibly an examination of his claims about being controlled by outside forces. Holmes paused in his pacing, fixing us both with an intense stare. By staging an escape followed by an apparent accidental drowning, they have ensured that Edgar Blackwood's death will be recorded as the tragic end of a fugitive, not the murder of a potential witness. Lestrade struggled to follow Holmes's reasoning. You're suggesting that someone within Scotland Yard itself is involved in this conspiracy? I'm suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures and access to secure areas has been coordinating these events from the beginning. The timing, the precision, the ability to manipulate evidence and witnesses. These are not the actions of an outside criminal organization. The inspector's face had grown pale as the implications sank in. If you're right, Mr. Holmes, then we cannot trust anyone within the department. The investigation itself may have been compromised from the start. Holmes moved to his desk and began sorting through his notes with renewed urgency. Inspector, I must ask you to exercise extreme caution in how you proceed. Share no details of our conversation with your colleagues. Trust no one with sensitive information, and under no circumstances should you return to the bakery alone. The bakery? But it's been sealed since the initial investigation. Precisely why it may now be the most dangerous place in London for anyone seeking the truth about these crimes. As Lestrade departed, promising to follow Holmes's instructions while clearly struggling to accept the possibility of corruption within his own ranks. Holmes turned to me with an expression of grim determination. Watson, we have reached a critical juncture. Our investigation has progressed far enough to threaten whatever enterprise required Mrs. Pembroke's death, and our adversaries have responded by eliminating their accomplice and infiltrating Scotland Yard itself. What do you propose we do? Holmes moved to the window once more, watching as Lestrade's hansom disappeared into the morning traffic. We must accelerate our investigation, my dear fellow, before they decide that we too have become liabilities that require elimination. Chapter 8. Holmes Tests. A theory That afternoon found Holmes in his most calculating mood, methodically preparing for what I had come to recognize as one of his elaborate psychological experiments. He had spent the morning composing several letters, the contents of which he kept carefully concealed, and had dispatched young Wiggins with specific instructions to deliver them to various addresses throughout London. "Watson, I propose to test a theory that has been forming in my mind regarding the true nature of our adversaries." I watched as he made final adjustments to his appearance, donning the disguise of a prosperous merchant that he had employed on several previous occasions. "What manner of test do you have in mind?" "I intend to present myself as a potential investor interested in acquiring property in the Whitechapel area, specifically near Dorset Street. If my suspicions are correct, certain individuals will find such an inquiry irresistibly attractive." Holmes had transformed himself with his usual skill: grey whiskers, a slight stoop, and clothing that spoke of provincial prosperity. "You will observe from a discreet distance, Watson, and note carefully anyone who approaches me or shows unusual interest in my activities." We made our way to a coffee house frequented by property agents and commercial speculators, located within sight of the sealed bakery. Holmes positioned himself at a window table and began making ostentatious notes about the surrounding buildings, occasionally consulting a leather portfolio that I knew contained nothing more significant than old newspaper clippings. Within an hour, his performance had attracted exactly the attention he had anticipated. A well-dressed gentleman approached his table, introducing himself with the smooth confidence of a practiced salesman. "Forgive the intrusion, sir, but I couldn't help noticing your interest in this particular district. Charles Murdstone of Murdstone and Associates." The man extended a calling card with a flourish. "We specialize in commercial properties in areas undergoing significant development." Holmes adopted the cautious manner of a provincial investor. "Indeed, I represent certain interests from Yorkshire, seeking opportunities in London's expanding districts. This area appears to offer considerable potential." "Quite so, sir. Quite so. Though I must warn you, recent events have created certain complications in property transactions hereabouts." Murdstone's eyes took on a calculating gleam. "The unfortunate business with the bakery, you understand. Local superstitions and such nonsense." "Bakery? I'm afraid I haven't heard the details." "Oh, a most regrettable affair. The proprietress met with an unfortunate end, and there have been wild tales about supernatural occurrences. Complete nonsense, of course, but it has made the local population rather excitable." Holmes leaned forward with feigned interest. "Surely such temporary difficulties might present opportunities for the discerning investor." "Precisely my thought, sir. In fact, I happen to represent a syndicate that has been quietly acquiring properties in this very street. We've had remarkable success in negotiating favorable terms with owners eager to relocate." From my position at a nearby table, I observed the conversation with growing unease. Murdstone's manner was altogether too practiced, too prepared for this supposedly chance encounter. Moreover, I'd begun to notice other individuals in the coffee house who seemed to be paying unusual attention to Holmes's performance. "This syndicate you mention," Holmes continued, "they must have considerable resources to undertake such ambitious acquisitions." "Oh, indeed they do, sir. International backing, I'm told. Railway interests, commercial development, that sort of thing. They're particularly interested in corner properties with strategic positioning." Murdstone's voice dropped conspiratorially. "Between you and me, sir, they've been most generous in their offers. Some property owners have found it quite impossible to refuse." "Impossible to refuse? You make it sound rather compelling." "Well, sir, when one is offered 3 times the market value for property in such a challenging location, most reasonable people find the decision rather straightforward." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And those who prove less reasonable?" Murdstone's smile remained fixed, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'm pleased to say we've encountered very few such difficulties. Most property owners in this area have proved quite cooperative once the full benefits of our offer were explained to them. At that moment, I noticed a figure enter the coffee house who made my blood run cold. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority that seemed to command attention without effort. His eyes, as they swept the room, held the same penetrating coldness that Mrs. Pembroke had described in her encounters with the mysterious gentleman. The newcomer's gaze settled on Holmes's table, and I saw recognition flicker across his features. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded room, and I felt certain that our surveillance had been detected. Holmes, still maintaining his merchant persona, appeared oblivious to the new arrival. "This syndicate of yours sounds most impressive, Mr. Murdstone. I wonder if I might arrange a meeting with their representatives." "Certainly, sir. Certainly, though they do prefer to conduct their business with appropriate discretion. Perhaps you might provide me with details of your current accommodations, and we could arrange a more private consultation." "Of course. I'm staying at the Langham Hotel, under the name of Josiah Pemberton." I started at Holmes's choice of alias, the same surname as the solicitor we had interviewed, and dangerously close to that of the murdered baker herself. It was either a brilliant trap or a reckless provocation. Murdstone made careful note of this information. "Excellent, Mr. Pemberton. I shall contact my associates immediately. I believe they will find your proposal most interesting." As the property agent departed, I observed him exchange a meaningful glance with the tall gentleman who had entered earlier. Both men left the coffee house within moments of each other, moving with the coordinated precision of individuals operating under shared instructions. Holmes maintained his disguise for another quarter hour before casually departing through a side entrance. We reunited several streets away, where he immediately discarded his merchant persona. "Most illuminating, Watson. We have just witnessed the machinery of our conspiracy in operation. Holmes, that tall gentleman, he recognized you, I'm certain of it." "Indeed he did, my dear fellow. Which means our psychological experiment has succeeded beyond my most optimistic expectations." Holmes' expression was grim with satisfaction. "By presenting myself as a potential investor, I have forced our adversaries to reveal themselves. Mr. Murdstone's immediate interest, combined with the appearance of our mysterious gentleman, confirms that we are dealing with a well-organized syndicate engaged in systematic property acquisition through intimidation and murder. But surely placing yourself in such obvious danger." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. Our evening reconnaissance of the bakery was destined to be interrupted by events that would prove our adversaries were far from idle. As we approached Dorset Street through the maze of narrow alleys that characterized Whitechapel after dark, Holmes suddenly grasped my arm and drew me into the shadow of a doorway. "Watson, observe the bakery carefully. Do you notice anything unusual?" I peered through the fog-laden darkness toward the sealed building. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then a faint glimmer caught my attention. There's light coming from within. Just a flicker, as if someone is moving about with a shielded lantern. Precisely my observation. It would appear that we are not the only ones interested in exploring Mrs. Pembroke's premises tonight. As we watched, the light moved systematically through the building, pausing at various locations as if someone were conducting a thorough search. Holmes withdrew his revolver, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency. "I suspect our afternoon's theatrical performance has accelerated certain plans. Someone is attempting to retrieve or destroy evidence before we can discover it." We moved closer, using the shadows and fog as a cover. The bakery's front entrance remained sealed with police tape, but Holmes directed my attention to a rear window that stood slightly ajar, clearly the intruder's point of entry. "Watson, I want you to position yourself where you can observe both the front and rear exits. If anyone attempts to flee, Follow at a safe distance and note their destination. Under no circumstances should you attempt to apprehend them alone. Before I could protest this arrangement, Holmes had melted into the shadows surrounding the building. I took up position across the narrow street, my own revolver at the ready, watching both entrances while straining to detect any sounds from within. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Occasionally, I glimpsed the moving light through the bakery's windows, but the searchers' activities remained frustratingly mysterious. Then, without warning, the light vanished entirely, and the building fell into complete darkness. I waited, every sense alert, expecting to see Holmes emerge or witness the intruder's attempted escape. Instead, what I observed chilled me to the bone. Smoke began to seep from beneath the bakery's front door. The realization struck me like a physical blow. Someone had set fire to the building, and Holmes was inside. Without hesitation, I abandoned my observation post and rushed toward the rear window that served as the intruder's entrance. The acrid smell of burning wood and something far more sinister met me as I climbed through the window. The fire appeared to have been started in multiple locations simultaneously and was spreading with alarming rapidity. Through the smoke and flickering flames, I called out for Holmes, but received no response. I made my way through the familiar layout of the bakery, now transformed into a hellish landscape of dancing shadows and choking fumes. Near the great brick oven, I discovered evidence of the intruder's purpose: scattered papers, some partially burned, and what appeared to be wooden crates that had been hastily emptied and abandoned. "Holmes," I called again, my voice hoarse from the smoke. A muffled response came from somewhere beneath my feet. Following the sound, I discovered that several floorboards near the kneading table had been pried up, revealing a cavity below. Holmes's voice emerged from this opening, urgent but controlled. "Watson, down here, quickly, and bring that lantern if you can find it." I retrieved the abandoned lantern and descended into what proved to be a carefully concealed basement chamber. Holmes stood amid a remarkable collection of equipment and documents, his face grim in the lantern's glow. "My dear fellow, we have discovered the true purpose behind Mrs. Pembroke's murder. This basement contains a sophisticated counterfeiting operation, printing plates, specialized papers, and enough forged currency to flood London's financial districts." The implications struck me immediately. The bakery was a front for counterfeiters. More than that, Watson. Look at these documents. They detail a massive scheme to destabilize British currency through the systematic introduction of perfect forgeries. The operation required absolute secrecy and a location beyond suspicion. Above us, the fire was spreading rapidly, and the smoke was becoming increasingly thick. Holmes quickly gathered several crucial documents and printing plates. "We must leave immediately. Our adversaries have chosen to destroy the evidence rather than risk its discovery, but they have also sealed their own fate. This counterfeiting operation represents treason on a scale that will bring the full weight of the crown down upon them." As we made our escape through the rear window, carrying the evidence of the conspiracy, I could hear the sound of approaching fire engines. The bakery was already beyond saving, its upper floors consumed by flames that painted the fog with hellish orange light. Holmes, whoever set that fire, knew you were inside. This was not merely an attempt to destroy evidence, it was an attempt to eliminate you. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The documents we had rescued from the burning bakery proved to be a treasure trove of incriminating evidence once we had returned safely to Baker Street. Holmes spread them across his desk with the methodical care of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts, his magnifying glass revealing details that would have escaped any ordinary observer. "Watson, what we have uncovered extends far beyond simple counterfeiting. These documents detail a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of British finance and government." I examined one of the partially burnt papers over his shoulder. The letterhead bore the insignia of a prominent banking house, while the content discussed monetary destabilization strategies and controlled economic disruption. Good heavens, Holmes! Are you suggesting this counterfeiting operation was designed to damage Britain's financial system deliberately? I am stating it as fact, my dear fellow. Observe this correspondence between our mysterious gentleman, who signs himself only as M, and representatives of what appears to be a foreign banking syndicate. Holmes indicated a series of letters written in multiple languages. They discussed the systematic introduction of forged currency at strategic moments to create panic in London's financial markets. The implications were staggering. But surely such an operation would require resources and coordination beyond the capabilities of ordinary criminals. Precisely why Mrs. Pembroke's death was necessary. She had unknowingly provided the perfect cover for their activities, a respectable, long-established business in a location where unusual nighttime activities would attract little attention. Holmes set down his magnifying glass and began pacing before the fireplace. But when their operation grew too large, they needed her gone. A soft knock at our door interrupted his analysis. Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, who appeared considerably more haggard than when we had last seen him. His usual confidence had been replaced by an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm afraid we have developments that make the Pembroke case seem almost simple by comparison." Holmes gestured to a chair. "What has occurred, Inspector?" "3 more bodies this morning, sir, all found in their homes, all apparently dead from the same mysterious cause that took Mrs. Pembroke. But here's the strangest part. Each victim was found clutching a piece of paper with a single word written on it." "What word?" "Bread, sir. Just that single word, written in what appears to be their own hand." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "Inspector, can you identify these latest victims?" Lestrade consulted his notebook with trembling fingers. "Charles Murdstone, the property agent we discussed yesterday. Dr. Pemberton Fairfax from the Natural History Museum. And—" He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Constable Williams, the man who was on duty when Blackwood died." The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. Each victim had been someone who possessed knowledge that could expose different aspects of the conspiracy. Murdstone knew about the property acquisition scheme. Dr. Fairfax had encountered the bone thief, and Constable Williams had been drugged and manipulated. "They're eliminating everyone who could provide testimony against them," I observed grimly. "More than that, Watson, they're sending us a message." Holmes moved to the window, staring down at the street with evident concern. The word bread connects each death directly to Mrs. Pembroke's bakery. They want us to know that these deaths are connected, and they want us to understand that anyone who threatens their operation will meet the same fate. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Holmes, there's something else. Each victim was found with traces of a white powder around their mouth. Something that resembles flour, but the police chemist says it contains compounds he can't identify." Holmes turned sharply from the window. "Flour? You're certain of this detail?" "Quite certain, sir. And in each case, there was evidence that the victims had consumed something shortly before death. Crumbs on their clothing, suggesting they had eaten bread or pastries." "Inspector, I need you to have those powder samples analyzed immediately. Use an independent laboratory, not the police facility, and share the results with no one except Dr. Watson and myself." After Lestrade departed, Holmes returned to examining the rescued documents with renewed intensity. His discovery of a particular letter caused him to straighten with obvious satisfaction. "Watson, I believe we have found the key to this entire affair. This correspondence reveals that M is not merely coordinating a counterfeiting operation. He is working to artificially create a financial crisis that will allow his foreign associates to acquire British assets at drastically reduced prices. Economic warfare. Precisely. By flooding the market with perfect forgeries at strategic moments, They could trigger bank runs, currency devaluation, and massive sell-offs of British securities. Their foreign syndicate would then step in to purchase devalued assets, effectively transferring British wealth to foreign control. Holmes held up another document, and here we find Mrs. Pembroke's true significance. Her bakery was not merely housing their printing operation, it was their distribution center. The counterfeit currency was being distributed through her bread deliveries throughout London's financial district. But how could she not have known? I suspect she did begin to know. Watson, her complaints about strange tastes in her bread, her customers falling ill, these were not random events. Someone was using her delivery system without her knowledge, and when she began to investigate, she became a liability. As if summoned by our conversation, another knock sounded at our door. This time our visitor was Miss Clegg, but her appearance shocked me. The young woman, who had been composed despite her grief, now appeared terrified. Her face pale and her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Mr. Holmes? They came to my lodgings this morning, 3 men, well dressed like gentlemen, but their eyes—" She shuddered visibly. "They offered me money to leave London immediately. Said it would be safer for me if I forgot everything about Mrs. Pembroke." Holmes was instantly alert. "Did they threaten you directly?" "Not in words, sir, but one of them placed a small loaf of bread on my table before they left. When I broke it open after they'd gone, I found this inside." She handed Holmes a small piece of paper bearing a single word written in red ink. "Soon." Holmes examined the paper carefully, then looked at Miss Clegg with an expression of grave concern. "My dear young lady, you are in immediate danger. You must leave your lodgings tonight and stay somewhere they cannot find you." "But where can I go? I have no family, no money for travel." "You will stay here, under our protection, until this matter is resolved." As Holmes made arrangements for Miss Clegg's safety, I reflected on how rapidly our investigation had escalated from a single mysterious death to a conspiracy threatening Britain's economic stability. Somewhere in London, the architects of this elaborate scheme were systematically eliminating anyone who could expose their activities, and we were clearly next on their list. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes' Grand Strategy. Holmes spent the remainder of that evening in intense preparation, his movements deliberate and purposeful, as he orchestrated what I recognized as one of his most ambitious traps. He dispatched a series of carefully worded telegrams to various government offices, arranged for Miss Clegg's temporary relocation to a safe house maintained by his network of informants, and made several mysterious telephone calls to contacts whose identities he kept strictly confidential. "Watson, tomorrow we shall force our adversaries into the open through a combination of irresistible bait and carefully controlled circumstances." I observed his preparations with growing unease. "What manner of bait do you propose to use?" "Ourselves, my dear fellow. We shall present our enemies with an opportunity they cannot possibly resist, the chance to eliminate both of us while simultaneously securing their most incriminating evidence." Holmes withdrew a leather portfolio from his desk, one I had not seen before. "This morning, while you were arranging Miss Clegg's accommodation, I took the liberty of creating a rather convincing forgery of my own, a document purporting to contain the complete details of their counterfeiting operation, including the identities of all participants and the locations of their remaining facilities. But Holmes, surely that's extraordinarily dangerous. If they believe you possess such comprehensive evidence, they will be compelled to act swiftly and decisively." "Yes, which is precisely what we require." His gray eyes held the cold gleam I'd learned to associate with his most perilous schemes. "Our adversaries have been conducting their campaign from the shadows, striking only when they could maintain the illusion of coincidence or accident. We must force them to abandon such cautious methods." Holmes moved to his desk and began composing what appeared to be an official letter. "I'm arranging to meet with representatives of the Bank of England tomorrow afternoon, ostensibly to present our evidence of the counterfeiting conspiracy. Word of this meeting will, through carefully managed channels, reach our enemies within hours. You're using yourself as bait to draw them into an ambush. Not an ambush, Watson. A controlled confrontation where we shall have every advantage. Holmes sealed the letter and placed it prominently on his desk, where any intruder would immediately notice it. The meeting will take place at the Criterion Restaurant, a location with multiple exits and excellent sight lines for observation. Our enemies will assume they can eliminate us before we reach the bank, but they will find the situation rather different from their expectations. I studied the forged document Holmes had prepared, noting its authentic appearance and convincing detail. How can you be certain they will attempt to intercept us before the meeting? Because, my dear fellow, they cannot risk the possibility that our evidence might reach government hands. Their entire operation depends upon maintaining the illusion of legitimate business activities. If the Bank of England were to examine genuine proof of their counterfeiting scheme, every aspect of their conspiracy would unravel within days. Holmes's confidence was reassuring, but I could not shake the feeling that we were walking deliberately into extreme danger. And if your trap fails? If they prove more cautious or better prepared than you anticipate? Then we shall improvise, Watson, as we have done so many times before. But I believe our adversaries have grown overconfident through their recent successes. They have eliminated witnesses with impunity, manipulated Scotland Yard's investigation, and destroyed their primary facility without consequence. Such a string of victories often leads criminals to underestimate the dangers of direct confrontation. As if to confirm Holmes's analysis, we heard the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs outside our door, footsteps that were attempting, without complete success, to remain silent. Holmes immediately extinguished the gas lamps, plunging our sitting room into darkness. Through the window, I could see figures moving in the street below, positioning themselves to observe our building. The trap was already beginning to close, but the question remained: were we the hunters or the prey? Holmes's whispered voice carried absolute certainty. Tomorrow, Watson, we end this affair once and for all. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The morning brought with it a revelation that would fundamentally alter Holmes's understanding of our adversaries. As we prepared for our carefully orchestrated meeting with the Bank of England, a telegram arrived that caused my friend to pause in his preparations, his face taking on an expression of startled recognition. "Watson, I've been guilty of a profound miscalculation." I looked up from checking my revolver, alarmed by the gravity in his tone. "What has occurred?" Holmes handed me the telegram, which bore the official seal of the Home Office. "Inspector Lestrade has been found dead in his study, apparently from the same mysterious cause that claimed the other victims. But this message contains information that transforms everything we thought we understood about this case." The telegram's contents chilled me to the bone. Lestrade had been discovered with evidence suggesting he had been investigating certain members of his own department for corruption. More disturbing still, his final notes indicated that the mysterious M, who had signed the conspiracy documents, was not a foreign agent, but someone operating from within the highest levels of British law enforcement. Holmes, if Lestrade suspected corruption within Scotland Yard, why didn't he confide in us? Because, my dear Watson, he was investigating someone he believed we would find it impossible to suspect. Holmes began pacing with renewed intensity, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Consider the efficiency with which Edgar Blackwood was eliminated from his cell. Consider how quickly our adversaries learned of our investigations, our movements, our plans. The realization struck me like a physical blow. You believe someone has been feeding information to the conspirators from the very beginning. Not just someone, Watson, someone with access to all police files, someone who could manipulate evidence and witnesses, someone who could ensure that every official investigation would reach predetermined conclusions. Holmes paused at the window, staring down at the street with eyes that held a terrible certainty. Someone who has been orchestrating this entire affair while maintaining the perfect disguise of official authority. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson's voice called from below, announcing another visitor. To our surprise, it was Chief Inspector Bradstreet, Lestrade's superior, arriving with the crisp efficiency that characterized his every action. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I've come personally to inform you of Inspector Lestrade's tragic death and to discuss the implications for your ongoing investigation." Holmes regarded Bradstreet with a carefully neutral expression. "Indeed, Chief Inspector, we had just received word of this unfortunate event." "Yes, well, I'm afraid Lestrade had become rather unstable in recent days. His notes contain wild theories about conspiracy and corruption that have no basis in fact. I thought it best to warn you that his mental condition may have compromised any information he shared with you." The smoothness of Bradstreet's dismissal of Lestrade's concerns struck me as remarkably convenient. Holmes, however, appeared to accept this explanation with uncharacteristic docility. "Of course, Chief Inspector, we had indeed noticed some peculiarities in his recent behavior. Perhaps it would be best if we discontinued our unofficial involvement in the Pembroke case." "I think that would be wisest, Mr. Holmes. The matter has been resolved with Edgar Blackwood's death, and further investigation would only fuel the sort of wild speculation that troubled poor Lestrade's final days." After Bradstreet departed, Holmes turned to me with an expression that combined satisfaction with grim determination. "Watson, we have just been visited by the architect of this entire conspiracy. Chief Inspector Bradstreet is our mysterious M, and his appearance here confirms that our trap has succeeded in forcing him into the open." "But Holmes, surely you can't be certain." "Oh, but I can, my dear fellow. Did you notice how quickly he dismissed Lestrade's investigation without examining the evidence? How eager he was to discourage our continued involvement? Most tellingly, how did he know we had received information about Lestrade's death when that telegram arrived less than an hour ago? The implications were staggering. If Bradstreet was indeed the conspiracy's leader, then our enemies had been watching our every move from within Scotland Yard itself. Worse still, they now knew exactly what we were planning. Our meeting with the Bank of England is precisely what Bradstreet expects us to attempt, but we shall not disappoint him, Watson. We shall attend that meeting, but not in the manner he anticipates." Holmes moved to his desk and began making rapid notations. "The game has entered its final phase, my dear fellow, and our adversary has just made the mistake of revealing himself before ensuring our elimination." Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. Holmes's revised strategy proved its worth within hours of Bradstreet's departure, rather than proceeding to our scheduled meeting with the Bank of England. We positioned ourselves to observe the Criterion restaurant from a concealed vantage point across the street. The sight that greeted us confirmed every one of Holmes's suspicions about the scope and organization of our adversaries. "Watson, observe the systematic manner in which they have positioned themselves." I counted no fewer than 8 men stationed at strategic points around the restaurant, each maintaining the appearance of casual loiterers, while clearly coordinating their movements. Their discipline and precision spoke of military or police training, lending credence to Holmes's theory about official corruption. "They expected us to walk directly into their trap," I murmured. Indeed they did. But observe the tall gentleman near the main entrance, the same individual we encountered at the coffee house, and there, directing operations from the doorway of the tobacconist's shop, Chief Inspector Bradstreet himself. Bradstreet's presence at what was clearly an assassination attempt removed any lingering doubts about his involvement. He moved between his subordinates with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, issuing quiet instructions that were received with immediate obedience. "Holmes, they've realized we're not coming. Look, they're beginning to disperse." As we watched, Bradstreet's expression shifted from confidence to anger, then to something approaching panic. He consulted his pocket watch repeatedly, scanning the approaching pedestrians with growing agitation. When it became clear that his intended victims would not appear, he began issuing sharp orders to his men. "He's sending them to Baker Street," Holmes observed grimly. "Bradstreet has abandoned subtlety entirely. If he cannot eliminate us in public, he intends to do so in our own home." We made our way swiftly through London's back streets, using routes that would bring us to Baker Street ahead of Bradstreet's forces. Holmes's intimate knowledge of the city's hidden passages proved invaluable, allowing us to arrive at our destination with sufficient time to prepare a suitable reception. "Mrs. Hudson must be warned immediately," I said as we approached our familiar door. "Already arranged, my dear fellow. I took the precaution of sending her to visit her sister in Brighton yesterday evening. She is quite safe from whatever transpires here today." Holmes led me not to our usual entrance, but to a concealed access through the building's basement that I had never known existed. We emerged into our sitting room to find it exactly as we had left it, but Holmes immediately began making preparations that transformed the familiar space into something resembling a fortress. "Watson, position yourself at the window where you can observe both approaches to the building. Under no circumstances should you expose yourself to their line of fire, but I need to know the moment they begin their approach." As Holmes made his final preparations, I reflected on how completely our comfortable sanctuary had been transformed. The sitting room where we had discussed countless cases in peaceful contemplation was now the stage for what might well be our final confrontation. "Holmes, there, I can see them approaching from two directions. Bradstreet is leading one group from the north, while his lieutenant approaches from the south with at least 4 men. Excellent, Watson. They have chosen to divide their forces, which gives us a significant tactical advantage." Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew the forged document that had served as our bait. "But before we engage our enemies directly, I believe it is time to spring the final element of our trap." He moved to the window and held the document clearly visible, ensuring that Bradstreet's men could observe it from the street below. Then, with theatrical flourish, he appeared to place it in his safe. Now they believe they know exactly where to find the evidence that threatens their entire operation. They will focus their assault on that safe, giving us the opportunity to turn their desperation against them. The sound of footsteps on the stairs below announced that Bradstreet's forces had entered the building. Holmes checked his revolver one final time, his expression calm despite the approaching danger. "Remember, Watson, Bradstreet must be taken alive. He's the only one who can provide testimony that will expose the full extent of this conspiracy." The footsteps were growing closer, accompanied by the low murmur of coordinated planning. In moments, our peaceful study would become a battlefield, and the outcome would determine not only our survival, but the fate of Britain's financial security. Holmes's voice was steady as he prepared for the confrontation that would end this extraordinary case. "Now we discover whether justice can triumph over corruption, my dear fellow." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed. The assault began with deceptive subtlety. Rather than the violent forced entry I had expected, we heard the careful sound of someone manipulating the lock on our door with professional skill. Holmes had anticipated this approach, positioning himself where he could observe the entire sitting room while remaining concealed behind his chemical apparatus. "They're using police techniques," he whispered. "Bradstreet is applying the same methods he would employ in any official investigation, which confirms his arrogance and will prove his undoing." The door opened silently, and 3 figures entered with the coordinated precision of experienced constables conducting a raid. They moved immediately toward Holmes's safe, exactly as he had predicted. Their leader, the tall gentleman we had encountered previously, began examining the lock with tools that spoke of considerable expertise. It was then that Holmes revealed the final crucial element of his deduction. "Gentlemen," he announced, stepping into view with his revolver trained on the intruders, "you are trespassing on private property under the direction of a man who has committed high treason against the Crown." The 3 men froze. but their discipline prevented any immediate panic. The tall gentleman straightened slowly, his cold eyes fixed on Holmes with the calculation of a professional evaluating an opponent. "Mr. Holmes, I presume? Chief Inspector Bradstreet suggested you might prove difficult to reason with." "Did he indeed? And did Chief Inspector Bradstreet also explain how his counterfeiting operation was financed by selling Scotland Yard's investigative methods to foreign agents?" Holmes's voice carried the authority of complete certainty. The white powder found on each victim wasn't merely a calling card. It was a specific compound used in banknote production, a substance that could only be obtained through official government channels. I saw recognition flicker in the tall gentleman's eyes, confirming Holmes's deduction. "Furthermore," Holmes continued, "the systematic elimination of witnesses required intimate knowledge of police evidence-gathering procedures. Only someone with Bradstreet's authority could have arranged Edgar Blackwood's murder while making it appear as an escape." The sound of additional footsteps on the stairs announced Bradstreet's arrival. The chief inspector entered our sitting room with the confident bearing of a man who believed he held every advantage, flanked by two more of his corrupted constables. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this unfortunate confrontation could have been avoided entirely had you simply accepted my advice to discontinue your investigation." Holmes's revolver never wavered from its target. "Could it indeed, Chief Inspector? Or perhaps it could have been avoided had you not murdered Mrs. Pembroke to protect your counterfeiting operation." Mrs. Pembroke was an unfortunate necessity. The woman began asking inconvenient questions about her late-night visitors and unusual activities in her basement. "So you eliminated her using a poison that mimics natural death, then arranged the grotesque bread display to ensure no rational investigation would follow." Bradstreet's expression grew cold. The bone-filled bread was insurance, Mr. Holmes. It guaranteed that even Scotland Yard would prefer to close the case quickly rather than delve too deeply into circumstances that defied logical explanation. Except that Edgar Blackwood's fragmented memories began exposing your use of mind-controlling drugs. When he started remembering details of his forced participation, you had him murdered to prevent his testimony. Blackwood served his purpose. His mental instability made him the perfect unwitting accomplice. And his death provided the perfect conclusion to an impossible case. Holmes had maneuvered Bradstreet into revealing the crucial details of his confession, but I could see the chief inspector's hand moving slowly toward his concealed weapon. The moment of maximum danger was approaching. "There is one final detail I should like to clarify," Holmes continued, his tone suggesting casual curiosity rather than mortal peril. "How did you arrange Mrs. Pembroke's death in a locked room?" Bradstreet's smile held genuine pride in his criminal ingenuity. "Simple misdirection, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Pembroke was poisoned elsewhere, and her body moved to the bakery after death. The locked room was merely theater designed to baffle investigators. Including the investigators you would personally supervise, ensuring that no inconvenient truths would emerge." "Precisely. And now, Mr. Holmes, this conversation has reached its natural conclusion." Bradstreet's hand moved toward his weapon, but Holmes had been preparing for exactly this moment. The confrontation that would determine our survival and Britain's financial security was about to begin. Chapter 15. The final gathering. What followed was not the violent struggle I had anticipated, but rather a masterpiece of tactical psychology that demonstrated Holmes's genius at its most brilliant. As Bradstreet's hand closed around his concealed revolver, Holmes's voice rang out with commanding authority, "Gentlemen of Scotland Yard, you're under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy against the Crown." The sitting room erupted in confusion as the door burst open to admit a squad of uniformed officers, led by none other than Inspector MacDonald of the Criminal Investigation Department. Bradstreet's corrupted constables found themselves facing the barrels of service revolvers, wielded by honest policemen who had been concealed in the building's lower floors. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradstreet demanded, his face flushing with rage and bewilderment. Holmes lowered his weapon, a satisfied smile playing across his features. "The meaning, Chief Inspector, is that your confession has been recorded by stenographers positioned in the adjacent room, and witnessed by representatives of both Scotland Yard's Internal Affairs Division and Her Majesty's Treasury Department." Inspector MacDonald stepped forward, his expression grim with professional disgust. "Chief Inspector Bradstreet, you are under arrest for high treason, multiple counts of murder, counterfeiting, and corruption of Her Majesty's police force." As the handcuffs closed around Bradstreet's wrists, his composure finally cracked. "You cannot prove any of these accusations." "My word against yours, Holmes, and I am a Chief Inspector of Scotland Yard." "Were a Chief Inspector," Holmes corrected. "And I'm afraid your own words have provided all the proof required. Your detailed confession regarding Mrs. Pembroke's murder and the locked room deception was particularly illuminating." The tall gentleman who had led the initial assault attempted to speak, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "Mr. Heinrich Zimmermann, formerly of the Prussian Intelligence Service, your presence here confirms the international scope of this conspiracy. I believe the Foreign Office will find your testimony most valuable." As the prisoners were led away, Inspector MacDonald remained behind to oversee the collection of evidence. "Mr. Holmes, how did you arrange for our presence here without alerting Bradstreet's surveillance?" "Simple misdirection, Inspector. While Bradstreet believed he was monitoring our movements, we were actually coordinating with your department through channels he could not access. The telegram announcing Lestrade's death contained a coded message requesting immediate assistance from trusted officers." MacDonald shook his head in admiration. "And the confession? How did you ensure Bradstreet would reveal so much?" "Psychology, my dear MacDonald. A man of Bradstreet's arrogance could not resist explaining his cleverness, particularly when he believed his audience would not survive to repeat his words. His pride in his criminal ingenuity became his downfall." As the last of the corrupted officers were removed from our sitting room, Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew the genuine documents we had recovered from the bakery fire. "Inspector, these papers contain evidence of a conspiracy that extends far beyond Bradstreet's immediate circle. Foreign banking interests, government officials, even members of Parliament may be implicated. The investigation will continue, Mr. Holmes. Every name in those documents will be thoroughly examined." After MacDonald departed with his prisoners and evidence, Holmes and I found ourselves alone in our sitting room for the first time in days. The familiar space, so recently a battlefield, seemed almost peaceful in its restored quiet. "Holmes, there is one aspect of this case that still puzzles me. How did you first suspect Bradstreet specifically?" Holmes moved to his chair beside the fireplace, his expression thoughtful. "Several small details accumulated over time, Watson. His immediate dismissal of supernatural explanations suggested someone who knew the crimes had rational causes. His knowledge of our movements implied access to police surveillance. Most significantly, his arrival this morning to discourage our investigation came suspiciously quickly after Lestrade's death. But surely those could have been coincidences. Perhaps individually, my dear fellow. But when Edgar Blackwood began recovering memories of his controlled actions, someone with authority had to act swiftly to silence him. Only a man in Bradstreet's position could have arranged both the murder and the cover-up so efficiently." Holmes reached for his pipe. His movements relaxed for the first time in days. The case of Mrs. Pembroke's impossible death proved to be neither impossible nor supernatural. Merely the calculated actions of criminals who understood that the most effective deceptions are those that prevent investigation from beginning. As evening fell over London, I reflected on how completely our understanding of the case had evolved from its mysterious beginning to its logical conclusion. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The following morning brought a gathering that would have seemed impossible when we first encountered Mrs. Pembroke's apparently supernatural death. Our sitting room hosted Miss Clegg, who had been returned safely from her protective custody, along with several officials from various government departments who required comprehensive understanding of the conspiracy's scope and methods. Holmes stood before the fireplace in his element, prepared to deliver one of his most intricate explanations of criminal methodology. The assembled audience listened with rapt attention as he began to unravel the elaborate deception that had initially baffled even Scotland Yard's finest minds. Ladies and gentlemen, the case of Mrs. Agatha Pembroke's death appeared to present us with an impossible crime. A woman found dead in a locked room, surrounded by bread containing human bones, with no apparent cause of death and no logical explanation for the bizarre circumstances. He moved to his desk and arranged several pieces of evidence in chronological order. However, when we strip away the theatrical elements designed to discourage investigation, we find a series of calculated criminal acts executed with military precision by individuals with intimate knowledge of police procedures. Miss Clegg leaned forward with obvious interest. But Mr. Holmes, how could they make Mrs. Pembroke's death appear so mysterious? Through careful manipulation of timing and location, my dear young lady. Mrs. Pembroke was not killed in her bakery at all. She was murdered elsewhere using a poison that mimics natural death. Then her body was transported to the bakery and positioned to suggest she had died while working. Holmes indicated a chemical analysis report on his desk. The poison employed was a derivative of curare, modified to leave no obvious traces and to cause death in a manner indistinguishable from heart failure. Bradstreet's connections within government chemical laboratories provided access to such sophisticated compounds. "But the locked room, Mr. Holmes?" inquired one of the Treasury officials. "How was that accomplished?" "Elementary misdirection, sir. The bakery was never truly locked from the inside. Bradstreet's men positioned Mrs. Pembroke's body, arranged the grotesque bread display, then simply left through the front door and applied the locks from outside using duplicate keys. The locked room was an illusion created by the assumption that no one would examine the locks for signs of external manipulation." Holmes lifted one of the bone-filled loaves, now preserved as evidence. The bread containing human remains served multiple purposes. First, it created such revulsion that investigators would naturally seek to conclude the case quickly. Second, it suggested supernatural or pathological causes that would discourage rational analysis. Third, it provided a perfect distraction from the real purpose of the bakery's basement operations. "The counterfeiting facility," murmured the Home Office representative. "Precisely. While everyone focused on the impossible locked room and the horrifying bread, no one thought to examine what lay beneath the building. Mrs. Pembroke's bakery provided perfect cover for a sophisticated currency counterfeiting operation that threatened Britain's entire financial system." Holmes began pacing, his explanation gaining momentum. "The systematic elimination of witnesses, Dr. Hartwell, Thomas Wickham, Samuel Crenshaw, and eventually Inspector Lestrade, followed the same pattern. Each victim was poisoned with the modified curare, then positioned with symbolic references to Mrs. Pembroke's bread to maintain the illusion of supernatural vengeance." "And Edgar Blackwood?" Miss Clegg asked quietly. Poor Blackwood was perhaps the most cynical element of their scheme. Using scopolamine-based compounds, they rendered him susceptible to hypnotic suggestion, then used him as an unwitting accomplice in their various criminal activities. When his memories began returning and he threatened to expose their methods, they murdered him and staged his death as an escape attempt gone wrong. Holmes moved to the window, gazing down at the street where normal London life continued, unaware of how close it had come to economic catastrophe. The entire conspiracy was designed to accomplish two objectives: eliminate Mrs. Pembroke's interference with their counterfeiting operation, and create such bizarre circumstances that no serious investigation would be undertaken. "They nearly succeeded," admitted the Treasury official grimly. "Indeed they did, sir. Had we not discovered the hidden journal and recognized the sophisticated nature of their deception, Bradstreet's conspiracy might have continued indefinitely, gradually undermining Britain's currency through the systematic introduction of perfect forgeries. As Holmes concluded his explanation, I marveled once again at his ability to impose logical order upon what had initially appeared to be chaotic impossibility. The supernatural had been revealed as mundane, the impossible as merely improbable, and the mysterious as calculatedly criminal. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by Holmes's revelations, moved with remarkable swiftness. Within a fortnight of Bradstreet's arrest, the full scope of the conspiracy had been exposed through meticulous investigation by Scotland Yard's Internal Affairs Division, working in coordination with the Treasury Department and the Foreign Office. Inspector MacDonald visited Baker Street to provide us with a comprehensive report of the proceedings. His satisfaction was evident as he settled into the chair beside our fireplace, bearing news that would bring closure to one of the most complex cases in our collective experience. Mr. Poole, Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am pleased to report that justice has been served in the matter of Mrs. Pembroke and the counterfeiting conspiracy. Holmes looked up from his correspondence with evident interest. What disposition has been made of the principal actors? Chief Inspector Bradstreet has been sentenced to death for high treason, multiple murders, and conspiracy against the Crown. His execution is scheduled for next month. MacDonald's voice carried grim satisfaction. Heinrich Zimmermann, the Prussian agent, received a similar sentence, though there may be diplomatic complications regarding his case. And the corrupted constables. Various sentences of transportation and imprisonment, depending on their level of involvement. Those who were merely following orders received lighter sentences than those who actively participated in the murders. Holmes nodded approvingly. A just outcome. What of the broader conspiracy's international connections? MacDonald consulted his notes. The Foreign Office has identified banking houses in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg that were financing the operation. Diplomatic protests have been lodged, and several arrests have been made on the continent. The threat to Britain's currency has been completely neutralized. Miss Clegg, who had remained in London to assist with the investigation, spoke quietly from her corner chair. And Mrs. Pembroke's bakery. What will become of it? The property has been purchased by a legitimate commercial syndicate, MacDonald replied. They plan to establish a proper bakery there as a memorial to Mrs. Pembroke's honest work. The basement has been thoroughly cleansed and will be used for legitimate storage purposes. I found myself moved by this gesture of respect for the innocent woman whose murder had initiated our entire investigation. A fitting tribute to her memory. Holmes had been listening with apparent satisfaction, but I detected something in his manner that suggested incomplete resolution. Inspector, there is one aspect of this case that continues to trouble me. How many other operations of similar scope might be conducting their business undetected throughout London? MacDonald's expression grew somber. That, Mr. Holmes, is precisely why the Commissioner has authorized the creation of a special investigative unit dedicated to detecting corruption within the police force itself. Your methods in this case have demonstrated the necessity of such oversight. A wise precaution. Bradstreet's conspiracy succeeded as long as it did because he possessed the authority to control official investigations. Future schemes will find such manipulation considerably more difficult. After MacDonald departed, Holmes and I found ourselves reflecting on the curious journey that had led from Mrs. Pembroke's impossible death to the exposure of international financial conspiracy. The case had tested our methods, challenged our assumptions, and ultimately demonstrated the importance of refusing to accept the impossible as inexplicable. Watson, there is perhaps one final irony to consider in this affair. What is that, Holmes? Mrs. Pembroke, who was murdered to silence her growing suspicions about unusual activities in her bakery, ultimately achieved her goal of exposing the truth. Her death, rather than concealing the conspiracy, became the catalyst that brought it into the light. Holmes moved to the window, gazing down at the busy street below. Bradstreet believed that creating an impossible mystery would discourage investigation. Instead, he attracted the attention of individuals who specialize in solving the impossible. Justice has indeed been served, I agreed, though I confess I shall never again view a simple bakery with quite the same innocent eyes. Nor should you, my dear fellow. This case has reminded us that the most mundane establishments may conceal the most extraordinary secrets. The art of criminal investigation lies not in accepting surface appearances, but in questioning everything until the truth reveals itself. As evening approached, bringing with it the comfortable routine of our shared domestic life, I reflected on how the mysterious death of a simple baker had led to the exposure of treason and the preservation of Britain's financial security. Such was the peculiar nature of our profession, where the smallest mystery might conceal the greatest crimes. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. 3 months had passed since the conclusion of what the newspapers had sensationally dubbed the case of the bone baker, though Holmes winced whenever he encountered such melodramatic terminology. The autumn of 1892 had settled over London with its characteristic fog and contemplative atmosphere, providing the perfect backdrop for the sort of philosophical reflection that my friend occasionally indulged in following our most complex cases. I found him one evening seated in his familiar chair, pipe in hand, staring into the dancing flames of our fireplace with a distant expression that indicated his mind was working through the deeper implications of past events. A letter lay open on the table beside him, correspondence that had apparently prompted this reflective mood. "Ah, Watson, you arrive at precisely the right moment. I've just received word from Miss Clegg regarding the Memorial Bakery, established in Mrs. V. Pembroke's honor." I settled into my own chair, noting the unusual serenity in Holmes's manner. "Good news, I hope." "Indeed. The establishment has become quite successful, serving the Whitechapel community with the same honest dedication that characterized Mrs. Pembroke's work. Miss Clegg has accepted a position there as head baker, finding in the work both purpose and a fitting tribute to her former employer's memory." Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, sending wreaths of smoke toward the ceiling. "There is something particularly satisfying about such an outcome, Watson. Evil sought to corrupt and destroy Mrs. Pembroke's life's work, yet ultimately her legacy has been preserved and strengthened. And what of the broader implications of the case? Has the Special Investigative Unit proven effective?" "Remarkably so. Inspector MacDonald reports that 3 additional corruption schemes have been uncovered and dismantled within Scotland Yard alone. The methods we developed during the Pembroke investigation have proven invaluable in detecting similar conspiracies before they can achieve their objectives." I observed my friend's expression of quiet satisfaction. "You seem unusually pleased with this particular case's resolution." Holmes turned from the fire, his grey eyes holding a warmth I seldom witnessed. "This case reminded me why we do this work, my dear fellow. When we began investigating Mrs. Pembroke's death, we assumed we were dealing with an isolated murder, perhaps committed by a disturbed individual. Instead, we discovered a threat to the very foundation of British society, one that would have succeeded had we accepted the impossible as inexplicable." "You refer to the locked room deception?" "I refer to the entire elaborate facade designed to discourage investigation. Bradstreet understood that the most effective way to conceal a crime is to make it appear so bizarre that rational minds will seek any excuse to avoid examining it closely." Holmes's voice took on the analytical tone I knew so well. He nearly succeeded because he exploited our natural human tendency to dismiss what we cannot immediately understand. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing down at the gaslit street below. Yet this case also demonstrated something equally important, that persistence, logic, and refusal to accept the impossible as final can triumph over even the most sophisticated deception. The methods you employed were certainly unorthodox. Using yourself as bait, creating false evidence to manipulate the criminal's actions. Desperate circumstances required innovative approaches, Watson. Bradstreet's position within Scotland Yard made traditional investigative methods impossible. We had to force him into revealing himself through psychological manipulation rather than physical evidence. A comfortable silence settled over our sitting room, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of London evening life. Holmes returned to his chair, his expression becoming almost philosophical. "You know, Watson, there is one aspect of this case that continues to provide me with considerable satisfaction." "What is that, Holmes?" "Mrs. I. Pembroke died because she was an honest woman who asked inconvenient questions about unusual activities in her own bakery. Bradstreet murdered her because he believed that silencing one persistent baker would protect his elaborate conspiracy." Holmes's thin smile held genuine warmth. He failed to consider that her murder would bring her case to the attention of individuals who specialize in answering the very questions she had been asking. A fitting irony. "Indeed, my dear fellow, evil often contains the seeds of its own destruction, though it may require some cultivation to bring those seeds to fruition." Holmes reached for his violin, a sure sign that our conversation was drawing to its natural close. As the first haunting notes filled our sitting room, I reflected on how this case had reminded us both why our partnership had proven so effective over the years. Holmes's brilliant, deductive mind, combined with his absolute refusal to accept defeat, had once again transformed the impossible into the inevitable. "Watson," he said softly, pausing in his playing, "tomorrow will undoubtedly bring new mysteries, new challenges, new opportunities to impose order upon chaos. But tonight, let us simply appreciate the satisfaction of a case well concluded and justice properly served." As Holmes returned to his music and I to my evening paper, I could not help but smile at the thought that somewhere in Whitechapel, Miss Clegg was preparing tomorrow's bread with the same honest dedication that had characterized Mrs. Pembroke's work. Evil had sought to corrupt that simple, essential act, but good had ultimately prevailed. Such, I reflected, was invariably the case when Sherlock Holmes applied his remarkable talents to the service of justice. The fire burned low as the evening settled around us, bringing with it the peace that comes from work well done and mysteries properly solved. In the morning, London would once again present us with its endless catalogue of human folly and criminal ingenuity. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of 221B Baker Street, all was well with the world.